attacks on 9/11. And we're reminded that the threat of Islamist extremism has risen to alarming heights, both domestically and internationally. And we've spent billions of dollars on global counterterrorism efforts and the ongoing sacrifices of our servicemen and women. At Word, we believe the missing piece here continues to be our failure to effectively curtail the radical ideologies that fuel the violence. Our work is guided by the principle that Islamist violence is bred by the extremists who legitimize their quest for power by framing their rhetoric in religious terminology. With the right resources and education, we hope that moderate religious leaders and their institutions could be that best defense against the dangerous indoctrination and manipulation of their community members. Yet despite the rise of ISIS and our never-ending cycle of only kinetic responses to ideological problems, one of our nation's oldest allies, Egypt, presents us with this unique opportunity to combat religious extremism in a way that can have a profound and global impact. From President Sisi down to the local preacher in the mosque, the Egyptian state is dedicated its intellectual and societal and financial capital to eradicating the dangers of Islamism from their institutions and their society. The process is at times ugly and painstakingly difficult, but they believe, as we do, that it is a necessary step in ensuring a safe and prosperous future for us all. Unfortunately, from what I have seen, our policymakers in Washington are not paying enough attention to what positive effects these efforts can have on the entire Middle East, and also for us here in the United States in our long-term battle against the proliferation of jihadist ideology and violence. Considering the intellectual nexus between radical Islamist thought and the support for terrorism, the time has finally come for the US to limit its engagement with the Islamist actors and empower religious leaders who share our values on critical issues like religious freedom, the freedom of association, and most importantly, non-violent solutions to social change. This report is part of a series that Word does to try to better understand the opportunities and, of course, the challenges that exist in various Muslim countries to reduce the influence of Islamist extremism in their local communities. You can find our other reports on Pakistan and Afghanistan on the web. So we have with us today Dr. Tariq Al-Hawadi, our Director of Religious Studies at Word, who received his degree from Princeton and his traditional Islamic science studies at Al-Azhar University in Egypt. And Mehreen Farouk, who was recently promoted to the Vice President of Word, and who I should say has led the field research for over half a dozen country reports that we have done. We are very, very proud of her work. You can read more about them both in the biographies that we provided. And we're most honored to have with us here Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, the current president of Broadcasting Board of Governors, Middle East Broadcasting Network. And in addition to speaking beautiful Arabic, like a native, Ambassador Fernandez previously served as the vice president of MEMRI, the Middle East Research Institute, and has a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service. While at the State Department, he also served as one of the first directors of the U.S. government interagency Anti-ISIS Messaging Center, known as the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, in that iteration of its life. I think now it's called the Global Engagement Center. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Tariq, and then Tariq will be followed by Mehreen with our keynote address by Ambassador Fernandez following those two. Thank you very much, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Adia. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I wanted to go over a little bit on a sort of more of a high level, some of the points of the report that I think are important, some of the things that, from a paradigmatic point of view, we were trying to get across. I'm going to leave the focus of Egypt more to Mehreen. For me, Egypt is home. It's the best place in the world, so I'm very biased, so I don't have to tell you why we focus on Egypt. That's why I focus on Egypt. But I want to talk a little bit more about Al-Azhar, because I think when you realize the size of the institution, the age of the institution, you'll understand why it's important to focus on the institution. institution. It's one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world. It currently has 64 colleges, over 16,000 faculty members, nearly 500,000 students each year, through the grade school, all throughout the country, all the way to higher education. That's the size of the institution. And maybe about 15% of those graduates every year of both the college and advanced studies are in what we call the Sharia sciences. Now these people, there's not 50,000 or 100,000 jobs in the Sharia sciences in Egypt alone. So these people are not just employed in Egypt, but these people come from all over the Muslim world, including countries like Iran that are Shia majority countries. And after they graduate, they end up going back to their home countries and serving in ministries of endowments, universities, schools, and also in the Western world. Many of the great Muslim institutions in Western places like Paris, London, Washington, D.C. have at their heart or at their origin some Azhar grad that started them, began running them, so on and so forth. So the institution is massive. And because it's massive, it's always been surprising to me why it's never really engaged. Because when you go to Al-Azhar, it's the only way I can liken it. It's like going to Hogwarts. It's really another world within a world. I mean, it's another world inside of Egypt. It has its own culture, it has its own dress, it has its own language. So it is very odd from that point of view, and almost, out of the norm. But at the same time, it's such a powerful force, not just within Egypt, but throughout the Muslim world. Now, while there are other Sunni seminaries, Morocco, North Africa, Yemen, Syria, when it was still intact, Baghdad, so on and so forth, there is no Sunni Islamic seminary that has the breadth, the history, the depth of Al-Azhar. And that's why I think it's very important. Now, I remember when I was in Princeton and I was doing my graduate work and I was looking at the codification of Egyptian national law. I remember when I was doing the research in the secondary material that there was a point in time in which secondary scholars would stop talking about Al-Azhar, ulama, Azhar scholars, and start talking about Muslim Brotherhood, Islamicist figures as the commentators on things Islamic as it relates to the subject matter. And I thought that was very strange. Well, what happened? How come in the 1700s and the 1800s, the early part of the 20th century, there were all of these, the Mufti, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, these people were being engaged and they were being talked about. But sometime in the 1920s onward, secondary scholars stopped talking about these people and start mentioning people like Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid al-Qutb, things like that. I thought that was very odd. And then when I began this work, I found the same thing in policy. I found the same when we were talking with government officials. I mean, a lot of these were supposed to be off the record, so I don't think I'm supposed to name names and things like that. But there's almost an exclusive disengagement with Al-Azhar from a US government point of view. And almost an exclusive engagement with Islamist organizations in Egypt. So I thought that was very strange, but it was something that I remembered from my graduate years that happened. So although Al-Azhar is very massive, it has an international reach, a very broad understanding of the Islamic sciences. I mean, Al-Azhar from the 1950s onward has led the way to have a reconciliation between Sunnis and Shias, for example. That's a very out-of-the-box way of thinking for those type of people. Shia law, or Shia fiqh, as we call it, is studied at Al-Azhar. It's a subject that you can become a graduate student and learn the Jafari School of Law in Al-Azhar, which is a Sunni seminary. Not only that, but many of the rulings of the Shia school have been adopted in Egypt's codes of law, and inheritance law, marriage laws, and things like that. So it has a very out-of-the-box, forward way of thinking for scholars. Again, for scholars. So its reach is very important, which is why we wanted to talk about what is the capacity that Al-Azhar has to be able to tackle this issue of extremism, of violence and extremism. The other thing that we discovered is that they're doing a lot. Now, they're doing a lot for scholars. These are not administrators, these are not MBA grads, these are super uber librarians and scholars. That's what they excel at. But they have an observatory, the Azhar and Dar al-Ifta, two separate organizations, but sort of collectively we refer to it as a religious establishment. For almost a decade now, they've had their own observatory to gather everything that has been written in the Arabic language about extremism, about the theological narrative of extremists. all of the articles, all of the newspaper articles, all of the social media clippings that they could find, all of the books that they could gather, those that are in print, those that are not in print, and they began scanning them. I mean, that's a treasure trove of information. They have been trying to respond to that. Now, they don't have a lot of execution capacity, which is what a lot of our recommendations are about. But from the subject matter expertise, from the raw material, as I like to call it, they're second to none. And they have 2 observatories, not just one. And it's only recently that at the government level, the Egyptian government is now forming this, national coalition to fight extremism and terrorism. But Al-Azhar really was at the forefront. Even in the midst of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and when the whole country was inside out and upside down, Al-Azhar was still doing these tasks. We're still collecting this information, collating it. And as a student, or as part of that world, you are going to receive that information. So in our classroom discussions, these things are debated and these things are talked about and addressed, so it's impacted onto the student level. I wanted to speak a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood, because when I began my part of the research and my part of the writing, I was not necessarily focused on this until I testified in front of one of these committees. Was it a Senate committee? A Senate committee. And I got a lot of community, my own community here, heat for a lot of my comments about the Muslim Brotherhood, and I realized that it's something that's very important. So there's about a page in the report that addresses what I refer to as the spectrum of extremist ideology within the family of Islam. And I think that's very important. Now, while the job of this report was not to discuss the Muslim Brotherhood and whether they're committed to violence and extremism and so on and so forth, it's something that was unavoidable, that we had to mention it and had to discuss it, because the paper is meant for policymakers and we want people to be able to benefit from this and hopefully implement some of these recommendations. Now, while we state very clearly that we have no definitive proof that the Muslim Brotherhood actively, openly supports violence and extremism, I mean, come on, it's a gateway drug. I mean, if my kid came to me and said, I'm going to smoke, but I'm not going to do drugs, I wouldn't be happy. I would try to dissuade him from that. While I could make an argument that smoking for a young teenager might be healthy or might not harm their health, and in some abstract way, I mean, come on, it's not a good habit to have. I see these groups as a gateway to that. When we began looking at ISIS documents, ISIS tweets, social media, a lot of these people are almost exclusively quoting Sayyid Qutb. Not even an array of Muslim Brotherhood figures, but one person in particular, Sayyid Qutb. All roads of extremism seem to go back to him in some way, shape, or form. Now, the new generation of ISIS extremists, they're a little bit lazy, so they just quote the people that were killed before them. But if you go back a couple of steps, you're going to find these concepts of takfirism, of jahiliyyah, of hakam, you're going to find them all going back to Sayyid Qutb. So it's a really big warning, I think, for us as we try to engage this topic a little bit deeper, that we understand Egyptians are very sensitive to this topic now, obviously, and very sensitive towards engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood. And barring any sort of commentary on what's happening on the policy level in Egypt, because that's not my role, I want everyone to understand that this is the background of where it's coming from. There's without doubt a spectrum of extremism, thought, and from an organizational point of view, the Muslim Brotherhood has a big question mark on it. And I think if we find ourselves engaging with them actively in places like Egypt and Syria, elsewhere, we really need to question our objectives. The last thing I wanted to say is I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of 3 type of examples of how CVE is not really the word that they use in Egypt. They're talking more about prevention and things like that. We'll just use CVE since that's what's in the paper. About these efforts that the Azhar institution in all of its forms is engaging. One is obviously research. And I think that as policy folks, we often don't have a big tolerance for deep research and analysis, but it's important, because someone's got to do it. Because we have to understand the substrate of this way of thinking. And I think that there's no better organization or better set people within the Muslim world than Azhar scholars to be able to engage in this type of, they love it, so let them do it and we can benefit from the research. The other thing is that they are engaging actively in social media. Now, it might not be the best engagement, but they do have multiple Facebook pages, multiple YouTube channels, multiple Twitter handles, and they are actively trying the best that they can with almost no money whatsoever. I mean, $0. They are trying to engage at that kind of level. even getting people to volunteer to edit videos, montage, things like that. And we should recognize, one, that that's happening, and it's happening much more frequently on a day. There are offices in the National Fatwa Office. There's a whole floor dedicated just to this, in multiple languages. Not just issuing fatwas, but responding to these social media memes, extremist memes. So that's low-hanging fruit. We can help these people with, I mean, they have $0. If we gave them $10, you know, think about the type of percentage increase that is in funding. So we're talking about very little, very low-hanging fruit. I think the social media is very important. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight is outreach. There are literally hundreds of thousands of Al-Azhar graduates throughout the world. Even heads of state. I remember meeting the former president of the Maldives. He's an Azhar grad. Members of the Jordanian royal family, Azhar PhDs. Heads of Islamic centers and mosques in the Western world, in Europe primarily, Al-Azhar grads. People that serve in judgeships, government, civil servant, charities, businesses. They're all people that have been affected in some way, shape, or form by Al-Azhar. The World Assembly, or the World Association or Assembly of Azhar Grad, WAG, which is not the best acronym, but it is what it is an institution that we had and I were beneficial to meet with, and they are trying now to tap into this outreach. In almost every single country, especially Muslim country, there is some serious engagement, recognition, understanding of Al-Azhar. And that's a powerful tool, a very powerful tool. That organization itself, but then the fact that there are literally hundreds of thousands of these graduates dispersed throughout the world that can be mobilized, that can be utilized, that can speak, that can teach. You know, so all of these are what I call the raw material. And we've provided a lot of recommendations. I think Mahrain will speak a little bit more to that. But these recommendations are based sort of on these facts. I just wanted to provide sort of a little bit of the paradigm of the scheme of how we were approaching this. And I look forward to the questions, if anything was unclear, and if I missed anything, I'm sure Mahrain will pick up on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Hadia. And thank you also, Ambassador Fernandez, for joining us today. So this summer, we've heard a lot of reports about ISIS in retreat. But this doesn't really necessarily mean that the threat of radical Islamism is diminishing. We may see reductions in the number of foreign terrorist fighters or shrinking territory that's being controlled by ISIS, but the extremist ideology that they espouse continues to radicalize individuals around the world. So the fight is far from over, particularly as these groups shift from establishing a caliphate to directing more and more attacks in the West. So to supplement our counterterrorism approach, then we really need to cut off the ideological fodder of these groups. Of course, Word's research affirms that there are multiple factors that may lead someone to becoming radicalized, and ideology is just simply one factor, alongside sociological issues, psychological conditions, economic concerns, or political grievances. But a lot of counter-extremism programs are designed only to promote social cohesion, or to target some of those psychosocial risk factors. Few are actively tackling the ideological piece. Now, of course, this is in part due to our historic hesitation engaging the public sector on religious issues. Even when in the past we've tried to get involved in the messaging space, our efforts have been really limited towards public diplomacy efforts, trying to deflect this idea that the US was at war with Islam. So when it comes to refuting radical interpretations of religious doctrine, the old adage has really essentially been, let's just let the Muslims deal with it from within. But unfortunately, we've done little to empower the right groups. Our report indicates that Egypt's normative religious scholars, if given the adequate social and political space, can play a particularly vital role in challenging extremism for several key reasons. First, as my colleagues alluded to, Egyptians have a real vested interest in preventing extremism. ISIS has already established a presence in the Sinai Peninsula, Christian churches have been attacked in heavily populated regions, and militants are also targeting high-profile police and military officers. So the problem is very real for Egyptians. Second, President Sisi has demonstrated a deep commitment to this issue, adopting a hardline stance against Islamists across the Middle East, North African region. And they've been calling upon religious scholars, like no other country has, to reform the way religion is taught so that there's essentially no more room for radical interpretations. Third, Egyptian scholars continue to enjoy respect and influence internationally. Many of the lessons learned and good practices of countering radical Islamism in Egypt could essentially be taught to other religious scholars around the world. But in order for us to really do this, we need to create the space. We need to create opportunities for Egyptian scholars to engage with their counterparts around the world. Now, fourth, there's no doubt that there have, of course, been accusations of human rights violations which have sullied the relationship between US and Egypt over the past few years. However, the Trump administration's generally positive overtures towards Egypt indicate that there's a real willingness to partner with Sisi to address the shared challenges of confronting radical Islamism. Some critics here in DC may suggest that Egypt has received enough aid from the US. And it is true that Egypt is the second largest recipient of military aid, receiving about $80 billion of assistance since 1948. It's not a small amount. However, Egypt cannot be abandoned at this important juncture. It continues to hold great geostrategic importance. US naval ships enjoy fast-track access through the Suez Canal, and Egyptians allow American military aircraft to fly over their airspace, which of course are key factors in our regional stability objectives. On top of that, Egypt has a large young population, the majority of which is under the age of 25. With few job prospects and the rising cost of living unaided, the youth boom could further destabilize the region. So in short, even as the US pursues a carrot-and-stick policy, recently suspending millions of dollars in military assistance until some democratic changes take place, we need to really reconsider the way that we have had a very narrow focus on our security sector's assistance and broadening it to address preventative approaches as well. Fifth, given the narrow space for civil society to operate in Egypt, quasi-governmental institutions like Al-Azhar, like Dar al-Ifta, and other religious actors who have already been engaged by the state for previous reconciliation initiatives are uniquely positioned to be engaged for peace-building and anti-extremism activities. Now, of course, the road ahead will not necessarily be smooth or straightforward. Egypt's traditional religious networks face several major challenges, and our report goes into a lot of detail about these, but here I'll just highlight three key issues. First, given the predominance of the Muslim Brotherhood in social and political discourses over the past century, there has been essentially what we've seen, a slow radicalization of the middle. This is a phenomenon we've studied in Pakistan and Afghanistan and many other traditionally Muslim majority countries. And it's demonstrated by the widespread rhetoric about the use of force to achieve socio-political change, or by the increasingly narrow attitudes about religious minorities or women's rights. The widespread influence of Islamist thought is even evident within the walls of Al-Azhar. As a result, the university has really had to take a look within, initiating campus-wide discussions with students to raise awareness and to cultivate public support for cracking down on extremist ideologies. Nonetheless, because some of these ideologies have become pervasive, traditional scholars will not only have to counter extremist content, but they'll have to actively offer positive alternatives, focusing on virtues of community, service, social cohesion. Second, although religious scholars who trained in institutions like Al-Azhar retain popular standing and continue to wield immense influence internationally, at times the Egyptian public, of course, has been quite critical of Azhar's alignment with the state on certain issues. In our report, we note that these historical institutions may have to consider some type of media or branding campaign to rebuild some of the trust that has waned over the past few years, perhaps touching on how Al-Azhar is part of Egypt's cultural legacy and still an important part of its future. Third, although traditional religious scholars have a limited, albeit growing presence in social media, Thark kind of alluded to some of these efforts. If you're on Facebook, you can search Daesh under the microscope. They recently initiated an online magazine in response to ISIS's topic called Insight, amongst many other efforts. And while these are some really solid, promising practices, they require a great deal of effort in terms of communications training, social media training as well, to really increase the impact of this content online. Part of the challenge here is that Al-Azhar has a slow and unwieldy bureaucracy. They're very slow to welcome change, and they simply cannot respond with the same type of agility or with some of the slick content that's being produced by groups like ISIS, which are essentially decentralized and receive a lot of foreign funding. So digital communications and social media training will be a must. So in conclusion, at a time when the Middle East is in turmoil, we really need to do more to stabilize and support our allies. And I think this report really points to the importance of reaching out and strengthening those in Egypt that have the potential and the capacity to authentically refute radical ideologies, and then to work with others across Muslim majority communities to train them to do the same.
Well, good afternoon. It's a great honor to be with all of you today, and especially to congratulate the Word Institute and their sponsors for this important report on empowering Egypt to defeat radical Islamism. This is a thoughtful and nuanced report with important action items, and I fully endorse it. I remember when I was at the State Department how much of the pushback against the Islamic State was then in its infancy, how meager so many of the tools that we had were. We at the old CSCC were in a way in the forefront of experimentation and pushing the envelope, but in retrospect it was a tiny, limited, poor effort at a time when many in Washington, and especially in the White House, thought that Salafi jihadist movements and their ideology was a relatively manageable problem, quickly on the way to resolution. The sense at the time was that propaganda didn't matter that much, and ideology didn't matter that much. That these were problems, yes, but that they were increasingly localized and manageable. The fall of Mosul in June 2014 changed all of that. But while we have seen major advances in analysis of the terrorist threat and in the way plots are implemented on the battlefield, on the field of law enforcement, in the field of technical means and capability, we still struggle with the beating heart of the matter. For still too many experts, the battlefield of the mind and the soul, the passionate ideas, images, and slogans that inflame the heart, that motivate great love and great hatred, great sacrifice, seem to be still too often a mystery. Messaging against jihadists to effectively counter their ideology is still in its infancy, in my view, despite the media blitz we sometimes see about this or that initiative, featuring glowing orbs or slick media coverage. This is true whether we're talking about what is launched by the private sector, by social media companies, or even by friendly governments. We tend to kind of want to play up success maybe more than we really should do. That's very natural because it's human nature to want to say, we're doing a great job, we're on the right road, perhaps what we've done so far is very modest. Right now, much of the hope lies in the fight against extremism, lies in this battlefield success, in better policing and intel, and in technically disrupting propaganda streams. We see, for example, at times, a real decline in ISIS propaganda on various platforms. These are all important, but not enough. The ideological building blocks of the jihadist narrative have barely budged. Islamism today in the region, in the Middle East, is still the default alternative ideology to that of the state. The ground has shifted over years. This is part of a process that has gone on for many decades. One of the problems when we talk about the Islamic awakening or the Salafi awakening or the Ikhwan is the idea that this somehow happened organically or naturally. No, this was fabricated. This was an investment in time by people putting their money and their effort into institutions of learning, into media institutions, into propaganda apparatus This is a crisis that we face today that was fabricated, not so much that just happened. I've written elsewhere of the three major key pillars of this toxic jihadist narrative. The nature of jihad, the nature of war, and here we can cite, unfortunately, the influence of a seminal Egyptian, of Abdel Salam Faraj, in the 1970s, in his infamous The Neglected Duty, which popularized Sayyid Qutb's idea that jihad was an individual responsibility to be taken up by individual Muslims, at variance with the history of Islam, where it was the king, it was the sultan, it was the caliph who declared that we're going to go to holy war against the Byzantines or whoever. It was not up to you as Mohammed Smith or whatever to decide to do things. This is this concept of individual jihad, which is part of our age and one of the challenges we face. The second of these key pillars of the extremist narrative, of the radical Islamist narrative, is this concept of loyalty, best epitomized by this term that they often use of al-wala wal-bara, of loyalty to something, and disloyalty or disavowal of something else. And the third point of this narrative, if you were to really boil all of it down into three simple points, is the concept of the other, of the concept of the Muslim versus the concept of the non-Muslim. Best epitomized by the weaponizing of words like kufr, shirk, rida, unbelief, polytheism, and apostasy. This is why the research of the Word Institute and this study is so vital. Also vital is partnering with Egypt in cleansing its educational system and religious institutions of extremist content that poisons the minds of future generations. When it comes to Egypt, in my view, we are all too often distracted. We're distracted with either the latest bilateral political eruption or with angst about the nature and intent of the Egyptian government. The challenge and urgency of fighting ideologically based Islamist extremism in Egypt is greater than either whatever bilateral upset there is or any possible dislike of the Egyptian leadership. It has reasons and a logic that can and should transcend either of these reasons. We must engage with Egypt. The West, not just the United States, has no choice but to work with Egypt, and it should do so. If anything, this engagement needs to be deeper and broader. We talk about the large US aid that Egypt gets. It's a lot of money. But actually, if you look at it, it's not that much money in the sense that it goes for certain limited areas. It's a lot of money often used in very narrow areas. There's a military component and there's a development component. If you take out the military component and the development component, you're actually talking about small amounts of money in that other area, that other battlefield going on, the battlefield of the mind and the battlefield of the heart. I think one of the legitimate criticisms that can be made of the Egyptian government efforts is that all too often it seems to focus on one organization, on the Muslim Brotherhood, rather than looking at broader intolerance, violence, and bigotry, the kind of background or building blocks of what eventually becomes Salafi jihadism. This intolerance or violence or bigotry either by Salafis or by traditionally ingrained supremacist attitudes. The excellent Egyptian Research Center, Ishad, recently noted that of the 510 sectarian incidents it recorded, 86% were by non-state actors. Obviously some were by malcontents or activists, and obviously some of the most notorious ones were by ISIS in Sinai or in the Nile Valley. But the problem is greater than those groups alone. Some of this most pernicious kind of everyday, routinized bigotry and violence is directed against the other. Usually Coptic Christians, but often secularists or liberals or whatever. Another challenge that Egypt faces is, in my view, is that sometimes the national media, which has a pro-government slant, can at the same time put out messages which either unintentionally or intentionally subtly reinforce the propaganda of Islamists and jihadists. What do I mean by that? If you're praising President Assisi on television in a program, and later on you have another program where you're talking about poisonous fantasies about the Jews creating ISIS, or about the West and its hidden hand in every Arab calamity and disaster, you're actually helping the enemies of the Egyptian government. You are, in a way, supporting the subtext of the broader jihadist narrative. I believe that the report's focus on empowering grassroots networks, whether Sufis or Quietist Salafis, is one that is at least seriously worth exploring. In my experience, in my 30 years in the Muslim world, in Africa, in Afghanistan, in the Arab world, over and over and over, I saw how Sufis, how heterodox Muslims, how liberal Muslims were outgunned, and I mean this kind of outgunning, outgunned, outfunded, outshouted by the work of Salafi jihadists, the work of activists who promoted this worldview, who had a lot more resources than your traditional Muslim leader, your traditional Sufi leader. I remember being in Niger and talking to the Sufi leaders there, and they said how it used to be that they could help a poor man or a family with, resolving some local problem, or maybe providing a little bit of money or something. There was no way they could compete with these flashy young men who came in with their degrees from the Gulf and with money. There was no way that the traditional structures of traditional Islam, which existed for 1,000 years, could compete with these nouveau riche extremists. This is something that needs to be addressed. One of the other major challenges, in addition to limiting oneself to the MB and the question of the self-inflicted wounds of the media, is that both Egypt and its international partners will face is that moving the action beyond the usual suspects. I say this with a lot of respect for my colleagues in the USAID, with whom I worked for with many years. There is often, especially in the US government, probably in other governments, you're always working with the same actors. You're thinking in development speak, in development sense, rather than thinking of ideology, rather than thinking of advancing, using these tools of development assistance and money and all of this for kind of hard-nosed foreign policy reasons. So we need to find ways that Egypt and its partners can move beyond the usual way of doing assistance, the usual way of doing development, which often, unfortunately, seems to become a kind of high-level but narrowly focused and shallow discourse that happens when the international community gets involved. I think Dr. Al-Gawhari is absolutely right that all too often what also happens in this development engagement with Egypt and with other countries, or has happened in the past, is that the international partner is attracted by the shiny new thing. And the shiny new thing is often the fool's errand of engaging with Islamists, somehow thinking that by engaging with them, you're going to gain something. It's not that the international community doesn't see that this is actually a gateway drug, it's that they fool themselves. And they think that this type of Islamism is some kind of anti-jihad kryptonite. And so I think they make a mistake and ignore kind of more traditional partners, like Al-Azhar, that we should engage in. I remember many years ago, in one of my first times that I was in Cairo, walking down the street and listening from the street to a Friday mosque sermon, a sermon vetted from the government. This was about 20 years ago. And outside on the sidewalk in front of the mosque were cheap, colorful little pamphlets for sale, promoting various aspects of an intolerant and retrograde Islamism. Yes, what is going on inside the mosque, yes, what is going on inside the classroom is important, but what is going on the sidewalk is also important. Some have criticized Al-Azhar. We saw this criticism earlier this year or last year. Some have criticized Al-Azhar when they refused to practice takfir on the Islamic State, when they refused to declare the Islamic State as being non-Muslims. I believe that actually that criticism of Al-Azhar was completely misplaced. Al-Azhar took the more difficult but the more serious way of doing, to realize that this is a problem not of Islam, because the problem is not of Islam, but a problem in Islam. The easy way out would have been for Al-Azhar to stand up and say, these are Khawarij, these have nothing to do with Islam. ISIS and these guys are completely divorced from any element of Islamic history or the weaponizing of terms from formative Islam or any of this. I think Al-Azhar, by being critical of the Islamic State, but not saying that these are, that we declare them, that we declare takfir against them, so these are actually non-Muslims, did the right thing. Al-Azhar has a long and glorious history. It also has a history sometimes which is less glorious. I'm not one of those that believes that it needs to be idealized, but it is on the front line of the struggle, and that's important. So just like we shouldn't idealize our relationship with Egypt, and often what you see in this town is people either demonizing Egypt or presenting a false positive view of Egypt, rather than engaging them, warts and all, working with them for the benefit of both us and of the Egyptian government and people. So engaging with Egypt more fully and deeply will also give the authorities in the Egyptian government the additional confidence they need to be bolder in combating extremism. And in conjunction with that, I am one of those who, I think I'm probably a minority in Washington, I am one of those who believes that while recognizing the limits of FTO regulations that the State Department has, I do believe that it is in the interest of the government of the United States, in our interest, to find creative, logical ways to take a harder line on the Muslim Brotherhood. This doesn't mean blanket, clumsy condemnation, but we need to find a way to raise the heat on the leadership of this organization, especially people, the Wagdi Ghunains of the world who go out of their way to basically promote a discourse from their exile in Turkey, well previously in Qatar and now in Turkey, that basically, again, supports the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's like coming up to an edge of being like them while not being them. We have to find a way for the US to take a harder line against this kind of incitement, this kind of poison that circulates in the region. Whether or not the FTO way of doing things is inappropriate, maybe it's completely inappropriate. We need to find other ways that are within the context of what US government does. This report, in its discussion of religious leaders and nuance about among various factions, I believe, is invaluable in helping the international community understand not just that it needs to engage with Egypt and with Egypt's institutions, but in a very deep and detailed way, how to do it and with whom to engage. Thank you very much.